So in the following, what I'd like to do is basically two things. For one, taking a closer look on how Frankfurt School critical theory, and I will limit myself mostly on the studies on authoritarianism only because we just have 20 minutes here for every presentation. I will take a closer look on how Frankfurt School critical theory was taken up by feminist theorists over the course of several decades, and pay particular attention to feminist criticisms of the Frankfurt School. And second, I will point out how these criticisms notwithstanding, Marxist-Feminist theorizing can benefit from a rereading of these studies on authoritarianism. By doing the latter, I in no way intend to reject the earlier feminist criticisms as unfounded, and I want to make that very clear from the start. Rather, I take as a starting point that any reading of a text is influenced by the broader theoretical and political context of its time. Situating these earlier readings within their particular contexts thus allows for understanding them as productive for the development of Marxist-Feminist theorizing without foreclosing the possibility of a different reading in our current conjuncture. Before I get to the studies on authoritarianism, let me briefly address the first encounter between feminists and the Frankfurt School, which took place through Herbert Marcuse's 1974 talk on Marxism and feminism. Marcuse's paper is an attempt by the then 76-year-old critical theorist to capture the significance of a then recent political phenomenon, the so-called second wave of women's movements that had only emerged in the late 1960s and in the early 1970s was still on the rise. The title Marxism and Feminism already indicates what was at stake in this first encounter. Nothing less but the relation between these two theoretical and political projects. Was the women's movement a petty bourgeois concern, as some on the old and the new left would have it, or was it a revolutionary force? And if socialism was understood in a Marcusean way, that is, as referring to a transformation of economic structures while simultaneously exceeding pure economic transformation, so if socialism was referring to something that we might want to call genuine emancipation, wasn't women's emancipation then always already a part of socialism? And could you conclude from this that thus no autonomous feminist movement was required, that it should rather merge into a broader socialist movement? Or would dispensing with autonomous feminist organization run the risk of the women's question once again being relegated to the place of a side contradiction? So these were like the debates back then. As my focus is with the Frankfurt School studies on authoritarianism, I will not go into a detailed discussion of Marcuse's ideas regarding the relation between Marxism and feminism. If you're interested, I can say a little bit more about that later. What I find striking about these debates in comparison to later feminist engagement with the Frankfurt School is their not predominantly academic character. Conceptual questions are already raised then, for example, whether it is productive or rather problematic for feminist analyses to refer to feminine characteristics, as Marcuse does, but these conceptual questions do not stand at the center. Rather, taking place in the context of a still expanding women's movement, and with women's studies only about to emerge, no neat distinction can be drawn between theoretical and political concerns of the participants. When feminists started to engage with the Frankfurt School studies on authoritarianism, this balance was already shifting towards the theoretical analytical pole. By the end of the 1970s, the women's movement was experiencing a process of institutionalization that not only led to the founding of women's centers, women's bookstores, women's shelters, and so on, but also to that of a new academic field, women's studies, because back in that time, it was usually referred to as women's studies, not as gender studies. All of these branches, as you might want to say, of the feminist movement back then became increasingly independent from each other. As a consequence, what became more important for feminist readings of the Frankfurt School now was the question to what extent concepts and ideas open up or, to the contrary, foreclose avenues for critically analyzing gender relations. And gender relations, if you take a closer look at these readings, was for the most part spelled out or understood as analyzing women's experience in a patriarchal society. At stake now was less the route a political project should take, but what this academic field dubbed women's studies should look like. Can feminist theory and analysis adopt concepts and methodologies developed by already existing schools of critical thought? Or do women's studies rather require coming up with new and original concepts and methodologies? Thus, when feminists from the late 1970s to the early 1990s turned to the Frankfurt School studies on authoritarianism, they did so not so much because they felt authoritarianism was a pressing issue. In fact, feminists paid attention to authoritarianism kind of only in passing. Their primary concern was with the Frankfurt School's portrayal of women and its discussion of women's place within the patriarchal nuclear family. This holds true for several papers published by feminist psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin, Patricia Gigantowicz-Mill's study Woman, Nature and Psyche, and various papers and a dissertation published by German-speaking feminist theorist Mechthild Rumpf. All these papers or articles were published sometime between 1977 and 1993, and later on there's only one feminist study that addresses the Frankfurt School's studies on authoritarianism, which is, at least to my knowledge, which is Liliana Radonjic, Die friedfertige Antisemitin. So while these feminist readings differ in some notable ways, for example, when it comes to the question whether Freudian drive theory is inherently problematic from a feminist perspective, and feminists should instead embrace an object relations theory approach to the psyche. This is something Jessica Benjamin is arguing in favor and Mechthild Rumpf against. I would like to highlight 3 points that these feminist readings share and and it is a critique of the Frankfurt School. For one, paying close attention to how women figured in the studies on authoritarianism, feminists concluded that the Frankfurt School's account of psychic development followed too closely the Freudian model. The charges raised by some feminists against Freud, an understanding of psychic development modeled after the son's experience that does not really consider the possibility of a uniquely female psychic development, in other words, an androcentric understanding of the psyche that was even more pronounced by emphasizing Oedipal conflict with the father while keeping surprisingly silent on the role of the principal caregiver, the mother. So these charges against Freud were extended to the Frankfurt School theorists because they were drawing on Freud. This critical evaluation of the Frankfurt School was, I think, a quite productive one for feminist theory insofar as feminists sought to come up with accounts of psychic development that would not succumb to androcentric bias. And, for example, Jessica Benjamin's The Bonds of Love, Psychoanalysis, Feminism, and the Problem of Domination can be read as a product of this critical encounter with Frankfurt School theory, I think. The 2 other points, in a way, address the question of authoritarianism, but neither one really made it a primary concern. With respect to the development of authoritarian character structures, what feminists took issue with was that the Frankfurt School described those as the result of patriarchal family structures in decline instead of in full bloom. Read along with some remarks by the old Max Horkheimer, feminists concluded that the Frankfurt School theorists in general, and Max Horkheimer in particular, were idealizing or romanticizing intact patriarchy in hindsight. Finally, and thirdly, feminists criticized the Frankfurt School scholars for one-sidedly focusing on the development of authoritarian character structures. Weaving together the first and the second criticism, they argued that had the Frankfurt School not been so overly concerned with the father-son relationship and Oedipal conflict, but paid equal attention to the pre-Oedipal phase, that is the mother-child relationship, they would have been able to account for the existence of psychic structures that do not necessarily feed into authoritarianism or an authoritarian personality type. And again, this is something I think that Jessica Benjamin does in The Bonds of Love. Unlike the feminist readings just discussed, contemporary readings like my own can rely on gender studies as an already established academic field with concepts and methodologies of its own. This theoretical context knows certain insights, most notably I think that into heteronormativity and the binary concept of gender as socio-historically contingent phenomena. So I think these are genuine insights or accomplishments of gender studies that represent an irreducible starting point for any feminist analysis today. And listening to Frigga Haug earlier this morning in her introduction, I tend to think that we might disagree on that because I think, you cannot go back behind these insights today. So the reliance on concepts and insights of its own that have already proven their analytical value allows for, and I would think it even calls for, new feminist readings of pre-second wave feminism theories like that of the Frankfurt School. It allows to focus less on what these theories didn't get right from a feminist perspective, than inquire into what they might still have to offer for feminist analysis today, or like maybe they even have something to offer that we have lost a little bit sight of within feminism today. In a political context marked by a wave of right-wing populist movements that according to specific historical trajectories and economic conditions take on different shapes. I mean, I'm thinking of Trump in the US, Islamist fundamentalism around the globe, the AfD and the FPÖ in Germany and Austria, respectively. I think the question of authoritarianism today once again seems pressing. Therefore, in the remainder, I'd like to briefly indicate the productivity of the Frankfurt School studies on authoritarianism, especially of the 1950 volume, The Authoritarian Personality, that was at least in part co-authored by Adorno. I will do so by focusing on the quite recent phenomenon of so-called anti-genderismos that if you have been here in an earlier panel in the other room, you have already heard some scholars based in Vienna talking about. So I will try to point out a couple of ways in which maybe the Frankfurt School can help us understand anti-genderism. So I'm only going to say briefly what I mean by anti-genderism or anti-genderismus. I think it's a discourse characterized by the rejection of the concept of gender and everything referring to it, most notably gender studies and the public policy of gender mainstreaming. In a nutshell, proponents of anti-genderismus suggest that preferring the originally English term gender to the German Geschlecht is tantamount to denying the existence of Geschlecht, by which they mean sex, that is, of what they consider a natural and biological fact. Therefore, they argue gender should be considered an ideology and a delusion. The spread of this delusion is attributed to the academic field of gender studies, which is portrayed as heavily funded with government money and vigorously attacked as a merely ideological undertaking that, given its delusional nature, should be banned from universities and public funding. And I think you can see traces of conspiracy theory or conspiracy theory thinking in these arguments. So in what respect now can the authoritarian personality contribute to an understanding of anti-genderismus? As I see it, there are two fundamental insights that these studies were based on, which prove quite helpful with this respect. The first major lesson, in my view, is the existence of what the researchers dubbed broad ideological trends. Their original interest, not surprisingly in the context of the Holocaust, had been with anti-Semitism. However, early in their research, these scholars had come to the conclusion that, unlike public opinion surveys, critical social research cannot rest content with taking anti-Semitic views as isolated opinions on particular issues. Instead, they argued, opinions regarding particular issues need to be understood in relation to other anti-democratic opinions and attitudes. So in a way, we might say these researchers were already arguing for an intersectional approach to anti-democratic opinions or positions. And here I come to the second fundamental insight. According to the authoritarian personality, these views are related insofar as they can be traced back to what the researchers described as deeper, often unconscious forces, as enduring psychological dispositions in the person, and underlying anti-democratic trends in the personality. In contrast to other variants of Marxism, the Frankfurt School thus not remains content with a more classical Marxist critique of ideology, but inquires into the psychic dispositions and attachments feeding into ideas. However, by doing so, they never succumb to psychologizing these views or the individuals who hold them, but develop a historical materialist understanding of psychic processes as marked yet not determined in a strong sense, and I think that's an important difference, by social conditions in general and economic conditions in particular. Anti-genderist discourse, I'd like to suggest, can be understood as what the authoritarian personality calls surface opinions. As I have already mentioned, a fundamental premise of the study is that critical social research has to analyze surface opinions regarding particular matters in relation to each other, and I think the case of the AfD, the right-wing populist Alternative für Deutschland, proves the importance and timeliness of this point. Antigenderismus figures prominently in the party's program. At the same time, the AfD and its recent success in various state elections obviously has a lot to do with its opposition to Angela Merkel's presumably overly liberal immigration policy. And the AfD's emergence in early 2013 in the context of the debt crisis was expression of a widely held view that our German taxpayer money shouldn't be spent to help Greece, because had people there only adopted a German work ethic, they wouldn't be in trouble after all. These positions and views are obviously related in that they converge in the AfD's program. So, while immigration clearly stands at the center of public debate in Germany these days, the authoritarian personality, I think, can remind us that understanding the AfD as a single issue party only concerned with putting limits to immigration is wrong. Taking up the fundamental insights of attitudes as related and thoroughly intertwined can help us understand anti-genderismus not as a side contradiction, something not really important for the AfD or right-wing populism, but as an equally significant part of the AfD's program. Moreover, the authoritarian personality suggests we ought to understand anti-genderismus as more than a mere opinion concerning our understanding of Geschlecht. The analysis of anti-genderist discourse, its structure and arguments, is without doubt important to gain an idea of this recent phenomenon, also because we're dealing with a very recent thing. And I think it is something accomplished well by a first anthology on this issue that was edited by gender studies professor Sabine Haag and Paula Irene Villa and published at the end of 2015. The authoritarian personality, however, compels us not to remain content with the analysis of surface opinions, but also to inquire into the psychological motivations and functions of anti-genderismus. With respect to anti-Semitism, the Frankfurt School researchers came to the conclusion that it functions as a, quote, a device for effortless orientation in a cold, alienated, and largely ununderstandable world. Gender studies, on the other hand, irritate common sense understandings of sex difference as the foundation upon which gender difference develops. They challenge the idea that sex and gender are essentially binary categories and thus necessarily must be understood as such, or that heterosexuality is more natural or normal than other forms of sexual orientation. In other words, contrary to anti-Semitism, gender studies makes an already complicated world seem even more complicated. And since Geschlecht and sexuality and a binary concept of gender and a heteronormative concept of sexuality are quintessential parts of our contemporary form of subjectivity, these challenges to common sense understandings are, I would suggest, at an unconscious level, experienced as a threat to one's identity. So it's deep-rooted psychic anxieties that help explain the rigor with which detractors currently attack a concept and an academic field, because I think it's quite strange that something like, an academic discipline figures so prominently in a right-wing populist parties movement. So, yeah, thank you.